in London, the headlines. Strong words from the US Secretary of State as he agrees with Britain that Russia was probably behind last week's attempt to kill a former Russian agent and his daughter with nerve gas.
President Putin, BBC News. Is Russia...
A question from the BBC's correspondent in Russia gets the brush off from President Putin as Moscow accuses the British government of making up fairy tales.
I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore, also on the program. With tight sanctions on North Korea, we asked how this shop in Pyongyang obtained its luxury goods. A leaked draft UN report claims 2 Singaporean companies are involved.
The main allegation against them in the report that we've seen is that they received funds in Singapore for doing business in North Korea. Both Singaporean companies deny any wrongdoing.
And a master of elegance, Hubert de Givenchy, the man who dressed Audrey Hepburn and Jackie Kennedy, has died at the age of 91.
Live from our studios in London and Singapore. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Hello and welcome. It's 9 in the morning in Singapore and 1 a.m. here in London. The US Secretary of State has expressed outrage about last week's nerve gas attack in Britain on a former Russian spy and his daughter. Rex Tillerson also says he agrees with the UK's assessment that Russia was likely to have been responsible. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has called the attack horrendous and completely unacceptable. Speaking in the British Parliament, Prime Minister Theresa May has demanded answers from Moscow.
Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. And we will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil.
Well, Moscow was quick to respond to Mrs. May's statement, with the Russian Foreign Ministry calling her suggestion a fairy tale and a circus show in the British Parliament. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports now from Krasnodar in southern Russia, where President Putin is on a visit.
Getting close enough to Vladimir Putin to ask a question isn't easy. But we were with the Kremlin leader when he visited Russia's National Grain Center. He wanted to talk about record harvests, but we wanted to know if Moscow had targeted Britain. President Putin, BBC News. Is Russia behind the poisoning of Sergei Skripal?
We're busy with agriculture here to create good conditions for people's lives. And you talk to me about some tragedies. First work out what actually happened there, and then we'll talk about it.
But when the British government announced it had worked out which country had attacked the Skripals, Moscow was in no mood to listen. Tonight, Russia described Theresa May's common statement as a circus show, and it dismissed accusations against Moscow as an informational political campaign based on provocation, a fairy tale. Meanwhile, Russian state TV has been pointing the finger back at Britain. The news bulletin suggested the UK had poisoned the former double agent. Only the British stood to benefit, he says. It feeds their Russophobia. Security experts, though, believe the trail leads to Moscow and to the Kremlin.
I haven't got the sense, frankly, that operations of this magnitude, something that you know is going to have a major geopolitical impact, can go ahead without being signed off from the very top. Now, whether that actively means a plan being spelt out to Putin and him saying, yes, go for it, or something a little bit more lightweight, but nonetheless, I mean, this is not something that came from anything other than the top of the system.
This weekend, Russians are expected to re-elect Vladimir Putin as their president. A new term that's set to be marked by a new confrontation with the West. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Krasnodar.
In other news, a leaked draft of a United Nations report claims 2 Singaporean companies have violated sanctions against North Korea. If the claims are proven, this potentially raises questions about just how common this is in the rest of Asia. The final report, which has been submitted to the UN Security Council, is expected to be published later this week. Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has told the BBC it is aware of these cases and has said that where there is credible information of offenses committed under Singapore law, the government has begun investigations. A draft copy of the report has been seen by the BBC. Here's more from Karishma Vaswani.
This is a shop in Pyongyang selling branded watches, handbags and alcohol, items which are banned under UN sanctions and Singapore law too. But now a leaked UN report claims there's evidence of at least one Singaporean company selling luxury goods in North Korea as recently as last July.
There are two Singaporean companies named in the UN report. They both shared the same director, and up until late last year, they also shared the same address, here at this building. The main allegation against them in the report that we've seen is that they received funds in Singapore for doing business in North Korea. Both Singaporean companies deny any wrongdoing.
According to the UN, in 1997, Singapore's OCN opened an account with North Korea's Daedong Credit Bank. It later changed the account's name to T Specialist, it's claimed. That account was allegedly used to transfer money for goods T Specialist sold in North Korea to its account in Singapore. Between 2011 to 2014, when sanctions had already kicked in, that account continued to transfer money into T Specialist's Singapore account, the draft report says. The companies deny any knowledge, both in relation to the goods being sold in North Korea and to funds coming from that account, which the report alleges. The other main allegation in the report is that OCN and T Specialist have long-standing close ties, including ownership ties, with Rugyong Commercial Bank, which has been on the US sanctions list since 2017. The companies have denied this.
I would say that our clients do not have any financial relationship with these entities in DPRK, North Korea. And they also do not have any interest or any financial interest or relationship with these commercial banks that you have named in the DPRK.
Have your clients ever had any financial relationship or done business in North Korea?
Well, they have done business with North Korean entities previously, before this UN sanctions came into force. But that was previously. And after the UN sanctions have come into force, and I think they have reduced their involvement, and these things take a bit of time. But this all form part of the investigations that are ongoing, so it would be very difficult for me to comment further on this.
Many of these transactions, according to the report, appear to have used Singapore's financial system. The Monetary Authority of Singapore told the BBC it's working closely with the UN on these cases. In a statement, it specifically warned that banks need to be aware of the increasing use of multi-jurisdictional front companies, shell companies, joint ventures, and complex or opaque ownership structures.
Singapore has a reputation of being one of the most well-regulated financial hubs in the world. So what's troubling is if this has indeed happened here, then how widespread a problem is this in the rest of Asia, where the banking sector is not as transparent and has serious issues with corruption and a lack of oversight. Karishma Vaswani, BBC News, Singapore.
Staying on the Korean Peninsula, and South Korea has engaged in a flurry of diplomatic activity to secure support for the planned meeting between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Trump. A South Korean envoy has met Xi Jinping in Beijing to brief the Chinese president on his recent visits to both North Korea and the United States. But both South Korea and the USA, they have yet to receive any further communication from Pyongyang about the potential talks. The BBC's Laura Bicker, who's in Seoul, gave me her assessment of North Korea's silence.
If you speak to analysts, they're not surprised in many ways not to have heard from Pyongyang. After all, when Kim Jong-un sent that letter of invitation to President Moon with his sister here to Seoul, it certainly didn't appear in state media. And that's one of the ways that the outside world gets to hear what's happening in Pyongyang. Also, it could be they're waiting for an official letter or some kind of official government-to-government approach from either the United States or South Korea. They may be waiting for a potential date or a venue. We don't exactly know. Plus, I think it's worth reminding people, Rico, that when it comes to North Korea, this is going to be a bit of a difficult turnaround. Kim Jong-un has sold anti-Americanism to his people. They are the enemy, and now he wants to speak to them. So there might be a kind of communication issue going on in Pyongyang. How do we sell this to people?
South Korean diplomats making their regional rounds to get all stakeholders on board, the Japanese and the Chinese.
Yes, and we heard from President Xi in Beijing after he met with the South Korean envoy, and he said and very much praised the South Korean government's approach. Remember, China has been pushing for these talks for some time. China's got a bit of a tricky one here because they don't want to be left on the sidelines. They don't want South Korea and other partners doing all the work. They want to be involved. Japan all along has almost kind of criticised South Korea's approach, maybe believing that it's being too soft on its neighbour. So we're waiting to hear a response from Shinzo Abe, but again, broad welcoming in the region.
Laura Bicker there in Seoul. In other news, a top United Nations rights expert says Myanmar's government must be held accountable for the crackdown on the country's Rohingya Muslims. Almost 700,000 have fled to Bangladesh since last August. The UN Special Rapporteur for Myanmar says the military operation bears all the hallmarks of genocide. The United States has drafted a new UN Security Council resolution demanding a ceasefire in Syria. The U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley accused Russia of failing to ensure the implementation of a similar resolution passed 2 weeks ago. President Trump has backtracked on his calls to raise the minimum age for buying semi-automatic rifles to 21. It was a proposal he championed following the school shooting in Florida. But he's moving ahead with his controversial plan to provide firearms training to school staff. The White House also wants to improve background and mental health checks. Police authorities in Austin, Texas have warned residents not to open suspicious items delivered to their homes after 2 package bomb explosions killed a 17-year-old boy and injured 2 others on Monday. Earlier this month, a 39-year-old man was killed in a similar explosion. Police say the attacks may be linked and are investigating racial hatred as a possible motive. Take a look at these posters. They are anti-Xi Jinping materials which have appeared in a number of Western universities in the wake of China's decision to remove the 2-term limit of the presidency. Well, criticism has been heavily censored at home. The posters are written in Mandarin and English and feature phrases such as, "Not my president," and "I disagree."
At least 49 people have died after a Bangladeshi plane crashed on landing at Nepal's international airport in Kathmandu. 71 passengers and crew were on board the plane, which veered off the runway as it came in to land before bursting into flames. Andrew Plant has more.
The mangled remains of a passenger plane that crashed on landing with 71 people on board. Many killed as the plane burst into flames, missing the runway at Kathmandu airport and skidding to rest in a nearby field.
It was shaking like this and was about to crash, but it picked up and flew as it shook. It then tilted and hit its wings and engine, then crashed. I saw it catch fire and ran towards it.
3 people fell or jumped out of the windows, but the end of the plane was burning very badly. It would be hard to survive.
In the local hospital, relatives waited for news. Names of the injured pinned to the walls. Officials say 31 people survived the crash. Some have since died from their injuries, others now in a critical condition. Basanta Bahara was pulled from the wreckage.
I don't know anything, I don't remember. I remember only the accident, nothing else. I don't know how I got out.
Sanam Shakya managed to climb from one of the aeroplane's broken windows.
The plane was going up, down, right and left, so I thought it was some air traffic only.
The US Bangla plane, a Bangladeshi budget airline formed in 2016, came down in daylight, around 2 p.m. on Monday afternoon. The company has been quick to dismiss an error by the pilot, blaming what they called a mistake by the airport's traffic control. A statement from airport authorities said the plane was already out of control as it came into land. Witnesses say the plane had approached the runway from the wrong end. The mountainous terrain of Nepal has a history of air accidents. A black box recorder has been recovered from what is Nepal's deadliest air crash for 25 years. Andrew Plant, BBC News.
You're watching Newsday on the BBC, live from Singapore and London. Still to come on the program. Tributes to the fashion genius, the man that brought us the little black dress. Hubert de Givenchy dies at the age of 91. Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Sharon Jitlale in London. Our top stories. The US State Department says it's outraged and agrees with the UK's assessment that Russia was probably behind the poisoning of a former Russian spy and his daughter.
Luxury goods inside Pyongyang shops. A leaked draft of a UN report claims 2 Singaporean companies have violated sanctions against North Korea. And tens of thousands of farmers in the western Indian state of Maharashtra have ended their protests after marching to the state capital, Mumbai. They were complaining about prices and land rights, but have called off the protests after meeting state ministers. This story is popular on BBC.com. Let's now take a look at some of the front pages from around the world, and we start off with the international edition of the Japan Times, and it reports that the Ministry of Finance has admitted to altering documents linked to the 2016 sale of state land to a nationalist school operator. And it says the revelation could have implications for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The Times reports that he has apologized, but he strongly denies any involvement in the decision to sell off the land. Let's now turn the page to the next publication, and it is Hong Kong's South China Morning Post. And there is another apology, which covers the poor showing by some opposition politicians in Hong Kong's Legislative Council by-election. And it describes the loss of the previous pan-democratic stronghold of Kowloon West as a shock reversal of fortune, and notes that the pan-democrat camp has publicly said sorry in front of the media cameras. Turning the page to our final publication, and that is France's Le Figaro, which carries a striking image of a smiling Xi Jinping on its cover, and it describes him as the new emperor, who is now free to rule for life following the abolition of fixed 2-term presidencies. More now on the British government's likely response to the nerve agent attack on a former Russian spy living in the UK. And until last year, Daniel Fried was the coordinator for sanctions policy at the US State Department. He's now with the think tank, the Atlantic Council. He joins me now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the program, Mr. Fried. Now, as a sanctions expert, what measures, if anything, could the UK possibly take to be effective, especially as Russia already has sanctions slapped against it because of Ukraine and Crimea? So would Britain's allies follow it in imposing new measures?
I think Britain has a strong case to bring Europe and the Americans together in a coalition to hit the Russians for various misdeeds. These killings on British soil, or attempted killings on British soil, are one. Their Russian interference in the American and French elections are another, and their general use of dirty money and cyber methods to interfere in our political systems gives us enough ground to go after them. I think we should.
Right, so what should the US and its allies do potentially to help the UK impose new sanctions? Because as we know, there already are some in place.
There are some. But the sanctions we imposed because of Russia's attack on Ukraine were not complete. There are a number of things we could do, and in sanctions a good rule is follow the money. We know that Putinism as a system rests on a network of corruption and very wealthy business people who are beholden to Putin. They have money in New York, Miami, London, and I think it is time for the West to start taking this seriously and start going after the channels of Russian dark money, invested in real estate and in other ways. I think it's also time for us to consider sanctioning the Putin network, as it were, that system of agents, oligarchs, cronies that he has used to support his rule. Now, this is a big deal. I would not do this if I were the British. I wouldn't do it unilaterally, but I would be talking to the Americans and the Europeans and trying to forge a common front. And I think America would be well advised to stand with Britain and work with the Allies in this matter.
Right, now, we saw that statement from the US State Department using some really scathing language against Russia, in fact, stating how it, for instance, continues to be an irresponsible force of instability in the world, acting with open disregard for the sovereignty of other states and the life of their citizens. That's the language used in that statement. But with the US, as you mentioned, also embroiled in its own investigations into Russian meddling of the US presidential elections, for instance, is this notion of an increasingly belligerent Russia sounding alarm bells?
Well, you're right about American politics. This is not an easy time for us, but I think Britain has a case to be made. We need, in the West, to show solidarity with one another, and we ought to consult on a general way to deal with Russia's aggression.
All right, Daniel Fried there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
My pleasure.
One of the great names in French fashion, the designer Hubert de Givenchy, has died. He was 91. Among his clients were American First Lady Jackie Kennedy and the film star Audrey Hepburn. For the latter, he designed the black dress she wore in Breakfast at Tiffany's. From Paris, Lucy Williamson reports.
It's one of the most famous dresses in cinema history, designed by Hubert de Givenchy for Audrey Hepburn to show off what he said were her very good shoulders and long neck, and to hide her skinny collarbone. Givenchy was feted throughout his career for mixing innovation with timeless simplicity. His fashion house, founded in the 1950s, showcased the concept of separates, skirts and blouses designed to give women more freedom in the way they dressed.
The dresses must move well on a woman's body, and if you put too many decorations onto a garment, it contradicts the piece itself. The material has a life of its own, and one should never contradict it if you want the fabric to speak.
His creations were worn by the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson, and by the former American First Lady Jackie Kennedy, something that had to be kept secret from the American press to preserve a sense of national loyalty. He sold the Maison Givenchy to the luxury French brand LVMH 30 years ago, but his views on haute couture were sought right up until his death. At an exhibition to celebrate his work last year, he told one interviewer, "The perfect dress can make many things happen in a woman's life. It can bring happiness." Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
He will be sorely missed in the fashion world. And you've been watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Stay with us. More on the leaked UN report claiming that 2 Singaporean companies have breached international sanctions against North Korea. We have a special report from our Asia business correspondent.
And before we go, let's take a look at these pictures because they are of Meghan Markle making her first official engagement alongside Britain's Queen Elizabeth. Of course, Prince Harry's fiancée joined other senior members of the royal family, including the monarch, at the annual Commonwealth Day service, which is held at Westminster Abbey. And don't they look wonderful? And that's it from me and Rico on Newsday. Thanks for watching BBC World News. Stay with us.
Good morning. Well, I don't know about you.